So most people don't realize that Monterey had a very active whaling industry here. In the 18th century and 19th century, when whales and whaling products were something that this country really needed to have, the big whaling companies out of Nantucket or New Bedford would go on those 3, 4, and 5-year whaling cruises. And usually the first place they went to were the Azores, which are those little islands off the coast of Portugal, where they'd get supplies and pick up these Azorean whalers. Then they'd sail down the eastern seaboard and around the Cape Horn, up the Pacific coast, all the way to Alaska, and all the way across the Pacific to Japan. They wouldn't return to their home port until they filled the hold of their whaling ship with whale oil. And this could take up to 5 years until they got home. Something happened in California in 1848. Gold was discovered on the American River, and all these whaling ships would come into San Francisco. I mean, let's face it, let's say we were all part of a crew of a whaling ship out of Nantucket and had to smell dead whale every single day for the last 2 years. They told you there was gold up in the hills for the taking. What are you going to do? Heck with this whaling. I'm getting me some of that gold. That's exactly what these Azorean whalers did. But when they got up to those gold fields, they found out that, hey, this isn't as easy as we were told. So they said, the heck with that, I'd rather be whaling. So they go back to San Francisco, but they have no money because they didn't get any gold, and they have no way to get home because everyone had abandoned their ship. So they remembered about a year before, a guy by the name of John Pope Davenport, a whaler from New Bedford, Massachusetts, had come to California and set up a whaling station in Monterey. He wasn't very successful. Well, these guys remembered going by Monterey and said, yeah, sure looked a lot like home, and there were a lot of whales down there. So they kind of migrated down from San Francisco, and they set up a whaling station right near the Monterey Beach, Monterey Wharf, and they began whaling what they called the old-fashioned way. In fact, the name of their whaling company was the Old Whaling Company. They would row out or sail out to the bay, in the bay, in these little small 28-foot boats, 6 guys in a boat, hunting a blue whale, gray whale, humpback whale. Can you imagine hunting a 100-foot blue whale on a small 28-foot boat? They'd sail out, and they would hunt these whales somewhere near where the Monterey Bay Aquarium is today. They would see a whale. Someone would yell out "Baleia," which means whale in Portuguese. Then these boats were equipped with a gun on the front called a Greener's gun, because it was invented by a guy named Greener, which worked with a black charge. There was a harpoon in the gun, which had a rope attached to it that was attached to the boat. This gun wasn't designed to kill whales, but in fact was designed to slow them down. They'd fire that harpoon into the whale. Now, if you're a whale and got hit with a sharp harpoon, what are you going to do? Oftentimes, the whales would turn and sink those boats, or they would sound or dive to the bottom. If the whalers weren't fast enough to cut the rope, they got dragged down with them. But most of the time, the whale would start running through the bay, dragging these guys behind him for hours at a time. And all the people that lived in Monterey in those days would line up along the coastline and watch these guys get dragged through the bay. They used to call that a Nantucket sleigh ride. Finally, the whale would slow down. Yes, they would kill it. That was the name of the game. They'd use these big long hand harpoons. And then once the whale was killed, usually it will sink. So it'll float back to the surface several days later. So they'll put a little marker out there so when it floats back, they'll go out and get it. So they go out to get the whale. They would usually take 2 boats. They would tie a rope behind its tail and then tow it back to the beach. Can you imagine doing this? It usually took all day in 2 boats. They got it back to the beach where they'd strip off the blubber. That's all they wanted was the blubber. They didn't want any other parts of these whales. They then tow the carcass of these dead whales back out into the bay. Well, the currents, being what they are in Monterey, would just push the carcass of those dead whales onto the beach that we now call Del Monte Beach. And at one point, that beach was littered with dead whale and whalebone. Now, you got a beach full of dead whale. What else do you think you're going to get down there? I mean, it didn't smell very good, that's for sure. Big, giant grizzly bears would come out of the hills from behind them there and go down and feed off the carcass of those dead whales, because grizzly bears love to eat whales. And I've read accounts of people who lived in Monterey in those days, and they said at night they could hear these grizzly bears walking through their neighborhoods. So when I ever hear anybody around here complain about raccoons getting in their garbage, forget it. So everybody stayed away from that part of town, and the whalers were all boiling down their blubber. And of course, you've been whaling all day, boiling blubber all night, you get kind of hungry. So oftentimes these guys would cook chickens in the hot oil, or they would throw little donuts in there to cook up. Of course, they were barreling that whale oil and they were selling it, and the whale oil was being used in lamps, to lubricate machinery parts. In the 19th century, all lighthouses relied on whale oil as their light source. So the whaling industry was very, very profitable. It also was very, very competitive. We started with about 17 whalers in 1854. By 1870, there were a couple hundred here. They sent for their families. They were living here. There were up to 5 whaling companies operating on the Monterey Bay at one time. And it wouldn't be unusual for more than one whaling company to converge onto the same whale, and they would have battles out on the bay over whose whale it belonged to. They actually would end up suing each other in court, and some judge would have to determine whose harpoon went into the whale first. So the harpoonist would work with the local blacksmith and put little secret marks on the tip of his harpoon point. The judge could go, oh, that's Jose's harpoon. That belonged to the Monterey Whaling Company. So they're getting mostly grays and humpbacks. California gray whale is going to produce about 50 barrels of whale oil, and a barrel in those days was 36 gallons. So we're talking about a lot of money. They were selling in 1870 for about $1.50 a gallon. So it was a very, very profitable business. And Monterey was very, very proud of its whaling industry here. In fact, when they would write about it in the newspapers, they always talked about how our whaling company brought in a humpback whale. But if it was the Carmel Whaling Company, then they say, oh, well, the Carmel Whaling Company. But it was our whaling company. They were very proud of it. They were almost like sports heroes. I mean, they were treated that way as well. I mean, it was a pretty cocky job that they had. If Nike were around in those days, Nike would have made whaling shoes, no question about it. So the whaling industry began to die out about 1874, not because these guys took too many whales, because they really never took that many. In fact, they lost far more whales than they ever took. But they began to slow down because other products were invented that began to replace whale oil. In particular, kerosene came on the market, and they couldn't compete with that. So these guys became full-time farmers, ranchers, dairymen, other kinds of fishermen. It was Azorean whalers that started the tuna fisheries in California. So next time you eat a tuna sandwich, you can thank a whaler for it. There was one company that continued to operate strictly for the tourists who were coming to Monterey to stay at the Hotel Del Monte and loved to watch these guys get dragged through the bay. If you look at the original map of the 17-mile drive, the first stop on that map is the Custom House and whale fishery, where you got to smell dead whale on your tour. And then you took it around to the Chinese fishing village in Pacific Grove, where you got to smell dried squid, then all the way around to the Carmel Mission and back to the hotel. The industry was revitalized for a short period in the 1890s. Out at Point Lobos in Carmel was actually an Azorean company and a Japanese company working together for just a few years. The guys didn't speak each other's languages, but they all understood the language of whaling. And so they actually made some money, but it just didn't last that long, and it died out around the turn of the last century. There was some other efforts where they tried to pick it up a few years, but it just never really revitalized itself until 1918, when California Sea Products Company opened a much modern whaling station across the bay in Moss Landing. They came in as early as 1915 and tried to establish whaling factories in Monterey and in Carmel, but they were turned down. Initially, they were turned down by the Monterey sardine fisheries. Those guys were really convinced if those whalers started whaling in the bay again, that whales were coming in to chase and eat sardine. And so if they came in and they took all whales, there wouldn't be any sardines for them. So they really fought against it, but that really wasn't the case. Eventually, they did open that whaling station in 1918. It was Norwegian. These guys were really good at what they did. It was completely changed. It was all done with modern equipment, steam-powered boats, big harpoon cannons. I mean, they could process a whale in just a few short hours at the whaling station over in Moss Landing, and they used all of it when they did that. In fact, they were so good at it, by 1926, they were done. I mean, they literally took most of what was out in the bay out there, but it was a very, very profitable industry out there. But part of that, too, is beginning in the 1920s, for reasons that no one has ever been able to explain to me, the Monterey Bay began to be visited by large numbers of basking sharks. Basking sharks are the second largest fish in the world. The whale shark is the largest. Basking sharks get to be 25, 30, in some cases up to 40 feet long. And they would come into Monterey Bay in the spring and just by the hundreds. And they were kind of a nuisance to the fishermen. Well, in 1924, Pop Ernest Stolter, the abalone king, and his friend Henry Leppert, who was a blacksmith who worked with the local abalone industry, came up with this idea. Hey, we'll take people out on Pop's abalone boat, the Pop Ernest, and for 50 cents, you can harpoon a basking shark. In those days, there were a number of old Azorean whalers still living in Monterey, and they'd go out with them, and they'd show them how to throw the harpoon and tell us tales of what it was like whaling in the Monterey Bay. In those early days, they weren't doing anything with these dead whales, and so oftentimes, once they killed it, and because the abalone boat had an air compressor on it for his divers, they would pump the carcass of the shark with air, flip it on its belly, and then Henry Leppert would get on it and dance on the belly of the shark for the tourists. Then in 1925, these two brothers, known as the Gilkey brothers, they got into that business, and they were only charging 25 cents to harpoon a basking shark, and they would actually jump on it and ride on it. But the basking shark's skin is like little teeth, and it would just tear up their legs when they would do that. But it was tough times, so people did a lot of things to make money. Max Schaefer, who was in the reduction business in Seaside, California, began to buy these sharks, and then he was grinding them up for dog and cat food, and then he was using the oil in these livers, and these livers, by the way, can weigh up to 2,500 pounds, have 1,500 gallons of a low-grade vitamin A in it, and they were using it for a variety of different products. In fact, he was producing this stuff called sun shark liver oil, and it was being advertised as something that would cure anything that ailed you. Essentially, it was being advertised as the Viagra of its day, although it probably didn't really do anything. His plant burned down in 1937. That sort of ended that stage of the industry. It was revitalized again in 1948 by a guy named Freeman Whitey Arbo. Whitey Arbo was a fisherman out of Moss Landing, and he was out fishing for halibut. And he saw these basking sharks in the bay. And so he said, hey, he caught them in a net and actually brought them in to Moss Landing. And in those days, Newt Hovden, Hovden's cannery, actually had a cannery in Moss Landing. He said, well, I could do something with those. And so he was going to use the oil and grind them up the meat for dog and cat food, and use the oil for paint and for soap. Well, they found out when they put the oil in the soap wouldn't lather. When they put it in paint, the paint wouldn't dry. But it was good for tan and leather. And so the industry was revitalized again, and it went on until about 1952. They got really sophisticated. In fact, there were several of these guys that came up from Southern California for the basking shark fishery, and they would employ pilots who would fly out and then radio back to the boats telling them where all the basking sharks were, which is a technique that the Monterey sardine fishermen began to use, that they learned from these basking shark fishermen. But Monterey Bay is the only place in the world where basking sharks are found year-round. They don't come in the large numbers that they used to, but they still come out, and they're still out in the bay out there. In 1932, there was a movie made called I Cover the Waterfront with Claudette Colbert. And I spent 5 years tracking this film down because there's a basking shark scene in there. And the premise of the film is that there's this fisherman in Southern California who's smuggling in illegal Chinese laborers in the bellies of sharks. And they needed these sharks. And they heard about this basking shark fishery going on in Monterey, so they came up with a film crew and they filmed them. And they hired a Monterey fisherman, not a basking shark fisherman, but they hired a Monterey sardine fisherman in his boat. It was the Coletto, Sal Coletto, in his boat, the Dante Alighieri, and they paid him pretty good money. This was during the Depression. And then they also hired a Monterey basking shark fisherman to go out and then to harpoon sharks for him for this movie. And they 3 or 4 days out there doing it. And if you watch the film, there's a scene in there where they're actually harpooning the shark. It's probably the closest thing you'll see to an Azorean whaler whaling a shark, because the guy who did it is a descendant of Azorean whalers from Monterey. It's just an amazing thing. So after the film was shot in Monterey, they said, well, they needed Sal Coletto to bring one of those sharks down on his boat to Hollywood, which he did. And then they said, we're going to have to use your boat for the movie, which they did. They actually built a half model of his boat for this movie. Well, he needed to get paid. This was during the Depression, and they hadn't paid him yet. And his crew was really anxious to get paid. And so finally he said, listen, you guys got to pay me for all this work I did. So you come in and we got the check for you. And it was late in the afternoon, so he decided to wait until the next day. He went into the bank, or went into the studio the next morning to got his check, and as soon as he got his check, it was the same day that Roosevelt closed all the banks, and so he wasn't able to cash his check. But eventually he was able to do that. But it was actually a very active industry when they were doing it here. Well, of course, the whaling industry today is all whale watchers, right? Everybody goes out on the boats to watch whales. As I mentioned, they never took a lot of whales in Monterey in terms of when the whaling industry is here. An average between the 5 whaling companies that operated between Monterey, Carmel, and Santa Cruz, those guys would take maybe 30 whales a year. Gray whales have made a full recovery, and you can see them, and blue whales in the spring or late summer. It's a whole different industry today.